Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking part in the seminar last week, the first part on free will and determinism, and the second part on personal identity through time. Now, during that seminar discussion over the course of the week, I think we got really to the heart of the matter on both of these two topics. We got to the heart of the key philosophical question and problem that these topics raise. You also brought out a number of different concepts of freedom and of personal identity that we were able to draw distinctions between. And crucially, a number of you raised some really important and in-depth questions and concerns about some of the assumptions behind some of the discussions of both of these two topics. So I think there's quite a lot in the seminar that we covered that should get you thinking about your views on these topics in preparation for your essays. But of course, there's a limit to how much we were able to cover in a week. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sum up some of the issues that we covered in the seminar, but I'll also fill in some gaps and cover some extra ground, right, to give you a broader framework and overview of both of these two topics, including some of the common theoretical options often discussed in the literature for trying to solve the problem of free will on the one hand and that of personal identity on the other. So hopefully this will give you a sense of the broader topics and help you as you prepare your own thoughts and essays on these issues.
So let's start with the topic of free will, which we discussed in part 1 of the seminar. You read 2 papers on this topic, and you may of course have read more independently, but the ones covered in the textbook were a paper by Schopenhauer and one by Susan Wolf. In the seminar discussion, we didn't go into the details of the papers, but rather we tried to get to the bottom of some of the key concepts they appeal to, in particular free will, determinism, and moral responsibility. We also tried to get to the bottom of some of the difficult issues that both Schopenhauer and Wolf grapple with. So what I'm going to do here is briefly sum up these key issues, the key concepts and concerns, as well as outline some of the common theoretical options for responding to these concerns, which you might find useful as you think about your position in preparation for your essays. So you may want to bring in some of the detail of Schopenhauer and Wolf's own positions in your essays, but I'm going to leave that to you to do for yourselves so you can think about where you might place them in your answers. A useful place to start is always by asking ourselves what's in question. In other words, what are we talking about? What are philosophers talking about when thinking about free will in this case? What is meant by free will in philosophical discussions? What is meant by the related concepts of determinism and moral responsibility, and how are these ideas connected? In particular, what's the philosophical problem underlying any reflection on free will, and in particular, any reflection on free will in relation to these other ideas? So I'll start with the problem and then work from there to try to understand what we should understand by free will and why it might matter. Now, in some sense or other, having free will, as we ordinarily understand it, seems to involve being able to make choices between different courses of action and to act based on our own reasoning and independent reflection, while always retaining the ability to, in some sense, act otherwise than we did. Now, freedom in this intuitive sense seems central to our understanding of who we are. It seems central to our conception of ourselves as persons, and it's central to how we relate to each other. In particular, it's central to our practices of blame, of praise, and of generally considering each other to be morally responsible and accountable for our actions. Right? Now here's the problem. There seem to be some strong reasons to deny that even our fully intentional actions are ever truly free. Right, so what are the reasons to deny this? Well, primarily it's the apparent truth of universal causal determinism. So the supposition that every event has a cause and that the chain of causes from our actions therefore ultimately traces back to events and factors and influences that were beyond our control, in particular because many of them would have occurred before we were even born. Right, so this would seem to suggest that the idea that we determine our own actions is in fact an illusion, right? Our actions seem to be determined, if we accept the truth of causal determinism, our actions seem to be determined by causes in which we ultimately had no say. So here's an illustration of the threat from determinism, right? The threat from determinism to this idea that we have any kind of meaningful free will. Right, so here we have someone who has a range of beliefs, desires, aims that they want to act on. These in turn seem to be based on a range of reasons that they consider relevant, based on their values. Now these, however, are in turn caused by such things perhaps as their personality, the experiences they've had, influences from their peers and others, which are in turn, you might say, determined by their socioeconomic background, a broader cultural context, their genes. And these ultimately are caused by the historical context which gave rise to the present cultural context. The genes of this person are determined by the genes of their parents and ancestors, and so forth. Right, so if we think about our actions faced seemingly with an open road of possibilities, as in this picture, determinism seems to suggest that these actions, even the ones that are externally unrestrained, right, there are no obstacles in our way, and even those that are internally uncompelled, so let's suppose we don't suffer from any particular phobias or addictions, even these actions, determinism suggests, do not ultimately originate from us, right? They're determined by a long chain of causes that necessitated them. Right, so the question becomes whether we should give up our deepest held understanding of ourselves and others. Should we give up our whole way of relating to each other as morally responsible agents? Or are we making some kind of mistake here? Does the kind of free will required for moral responsibility really require that we be in control of this full chain of causes? Or does it require that there be no such causes at all, right? But if so, does the idea of free will as acting independently of any kind of cause actually make sense? Right, so we have this question of, have we got hold of the right way of thinking about free will, or have we kind of been led astray here? So let's try to think about some possible different ways of understanding what is meant by free will, and then asking ourselves, which of these conceptions of free will is the kind that really matters, in particular in light of concerns about moral responsibility and preserving the way in which we relate to each other. Right, so we just saw that there seems to be one form of freedom that we clearly lack if determinism is true. Right, so if determinism is true, which it plausibly is, then we're not free from all necessity. Okay, our actions are not free from causation. We're not free from the way the world works. Our actions are not free from the laws of physics. And in particular, if determinism is true, we do not have the ability to act against our own beliefs, desires, preferences, values, and so forth. So we don't have this first kind of freedom if determinism is true, freedom from causation. Now, the second and third conceptions of freedom here do seem to remain possible even if causal determinism is true. Right, so these are freedom from physical restraint and internal compulsion, and freedom from our momentary desires, whims, and passing thoughts. Right, so not all of our actions are physically impeded or internally compelled, even if determinism is true. Moreover, many of our actions can, it seems, be the result of longer-term planning and long-term reasoning. So not all of our actions are just reactions to our immediate circumstances and environment. What we do instead is often determined by our longer-term plans and values. So they're often the deciding factor in determining, say, which of two immediate but opposing desires we might actually end up acting on. Now, all of this is possible even if our values and our long-term plans are themselves determined by prior factors, including, as we saw in the previous slide, our background, past experiences, personality, genes, and so on. Right, so the question really is then whether we have, or whether having freedom in these two latter senses is enough to justify blame, praise, and the variety of other attitudes that we have towards each other, which all seem to presuppose thinking of each other as morally responsible agents. Right, so to help you make up your mind and to help you think about this for yourselves, I'm going to set out 3 standard theoretical options that philosophers tend to take, though there are various versions of each one. So interestingly, in particular, you'll remember from reading Susan Wolf that she is a compatibilist about the attribution of praise, but an incompatibilist about the attribution of blame. So in other words, and I'll explain in a minute what compatibilism and incompatibilism are a bit further, she takes the view that determinism is compatible with people being justifiably praised for their good actions, but for the most part, determinism rules out, on her view, the justifiability of blaming people for wrong actions. All right, so that's something you might want to think about and come to a view on. But I'll leave you to do that for yourselves, and I'll set out some of the standard options for responding to these types of concerns about how we should understand freedom and which kind of freedom matters. Compatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are compatible, right? So the truth of determinism doesn't undermine freedom in the sense that matters and is required for moral responsibility. So there are a number of versions of this view which you may want to consider, but essentially on this type of view, the kind of freedom required for moral responsibility is essentially freedom from external restraint, it's freedom from internal compulsion, and it's perhaps the ability to be guided by factors beyond immediate stimuli. So to be guided by values, our longer-term plans, our long-term conceptions of the kind of life we want to lead, the kind of people we want to be. So often those who hold this view do so on the grounds that our beliefs, desires, and our particular values and long-term aims actually capture who we fundamentally are. So it would make no sense to consider a person as the originator of their actions if these actions did not emerge from who they were as a person. Now, these aspects of who they are as a person may well be a product of their life, their background, and so on, but it is who they are. So if someone acted free from all necessity, they would, or so compatibilists sometimes argue, be essentially acting at random. Their actions would not really be their own actions in any meaningful sense because they wouldn't arise out of who they are. Right, so acting independently of your own beliefs and desires doesn't, on the compatibilist view, make you come out as acting freely or as morally responsible. The kind of freedom needed for moral responsibility is that you be acting on who you are, on the beliefs and desires and values that you have. Okay, so that's compatibilism. Incompatibilism is the view that free will and determinism are incompatible along the lines suggested by Schopenhauer, for example. So in other words, on this view, the truth of determinism does undermine freedom in the sense that matters for moral responsibility. It does undermine the kind of freedom that underlies our sense of being persons, so kind of autonomous, reflective beings. Now, there are essentially 2 camps in the incompatibilist framework. So there are libertarian incompatibilists, or sometimes called optimist incompatibilists. They believe that determinism is actually false, right? So freedom in the sense that matters, a kind of incompatibilist freedom, sort of absence of all necessity, is preserved. In fact, they argue that being free in this strong sense is obvious, it's somehow self-evident, and so determinism must be false. Okay, now the problem that we briefly discussed in the seminar with this, and that compatibilists often raise, is that it's not clear what it would truly mean for determinism to be false, and in particular, how determinism being false could provide for meaningful freedom. Right, so this is the same concern that I mentioned earlier about compatibilists worrying that the falsehood of determinism would just make room for a kind of randomness, but not for meaningful human freedom, and certainly not for individuals to be justifiably held morally responsible for their actions. Okay, so what would it even mean to hold someone accountable for an uncaused, essentially random piece of behavior? Right, so this is a concern one might have about incompatibilism. Nevertheless, there's a second camp of incompatibilists who agree with the problems of that compatibilists raise regarding a kind of freedom from necessity. They don't think that would really provide for genuine freedom and moral responsibility either, but essentially they are determinists, and they think that at least our notion of moral responsibility does presuppose a kind of freedom from all necessity. So they are incompatibilists in this sense that they don't think that merely acting on our own beliefs and desires is enough to deliver moral responsibility. They also don't think that incompatibilist freedom could deliver it, but in any case, they believe that determinism is true. And so ultimately, on this view, our whole way of relating to each other is based on a kind of a false assumption, a kind of freedom that maybe doesn't even make sense, but in any case that we lack. So on their view, a complete overhaul of our way of thinking of ourselves and of relating to each other is needed. Now, a question we might ask ourselves about this is, can this actually be done? Can we enact this kind of overhaul? What would it look like to no longer treat each other as moral agents? Right? Isn't treating each other as morally responsible not fundamentally presupposed by everything that we do, right? All our relations with others. It might even, on some views, it's presupposed even by our very asking of questions about free will and moral responsibility. Such questions don't make sense if we just think of ourselves as kind of automata. Right, so is this morally engaged attitude one we can actually abandon at all? Now, this is a concern that's raised by Peter Strawson in his seminal paper, Freedom and Resentment, which you don't need to read, but you may want to. It's quite a complex paper, but so I'll leave that as something you might want to do in your own time if you want to think about this topic further. And he is really concerned about this idea of whether it even makes sense to give up the sort of morally engaged attitude, regardless of whether we believe that determinism is true, or regardless of whether we think of that as compatible or not with free will or moral responsibility. So his view is sometimes described as a kind of compatibilism between compatibilism and an incompatibilism in the senses 1 and 2 here. So I'll let you reflect on that on your own if you want to, but otherwise you can just focus on the two main strands, compatibilism and incompatibilism, and also reflect on how Schopenhauer and Susan Wolf's discussions fit or don't fully fit into these camps. What I'd like to move on to next, though, is to just give you a bit more of a formal presentation of how these arguments might go, so you have an idea of the sense of the structure of these kinds of arguments for each of these views, compatibilism and incompatibilism. Okay, so here's the type of argument that compatibilists tend to put forward, just structuring this in a kind of more formal way to kind of give you an idea of what the premises are and what you might want to question within the compatibilist line of argument. So essentially they argue something like this. Premise 1, we are, within a given set of circumstances, free to act as we prefer and as we believe to be right, so in line with our values, our plans, and so forth. Premise 2, this is the only notion of freedom that's integral to our conception of ourselves as persons and as morally responsible agents. So this is the kind of freedom that's required and all that's required for moral responsibility. Premise 3, this notion of freedom is compatible with causal determinism, right? Even if causal determinism is true, we can act as we prefer and as we believe to be right, even if our preferences and our values may well have themselves prior causes. Therefore, it follows 4, and this is the conclusion of the argument, neither personhood nor moral responsibility is under threat from causal determinism. Okay, so this is essentially the compatibilist line here, just some things you might want to think about on your own. One might be, why might someone hold premise 2? Do you agree with that? Why might someone object? So you can, if you want to consider compatibilism, then these are some of the questions you might ask yourself, particularly as premise 2 is perhaps the most pivotal one in this argument, right? So I'll leave you with that, though, of course, just to give you a little hint, one of the concerns one might have here is the nagging sense that this kind of freedom is not enough, right? So this leads to the sort of incompatibilist position. Okay, so the incompatibilist line of argument goes something like this, though I should mention that since there's more than one strand of incompatibilism, this is the kind of argument that would be put forward by the determinist pessimist incompatibilists. So that would go something like this, in a parallel way to the argument we just saw for compatibilism. Here there's a sort of replacement of the relevant notion of freedom. So on this line of argument, premise one is our actions are not free from necessity, so causal determinism is true. Premise two, freedom from necessity is presupposed by our conception of ourselves as persons, that is, as autonomous reflective agents, and as morally responsible agents in particular. Premise three, this notion of freedom is incompatible with causal determinism. Therefore, and here's the conclusion, point four, moral responsibility is undermined by causal determinism. And so our whole way of relating to each other should essentially be abandoned if we're going to align our actions with the way things really are. So there's a number of things you could think about here. One is you could try in your own time to reconstruct the libertarian optimist version of an incompatibilist argument, which leads to a very different conclusion, right? That moral responsibility is not undermined. But in relation to that, you might ask yourself whether libertarians can meet the challenge of providing an account of absence from necessity, right? This kind of very strong freedom, which would allow for the possibility of a meaningfully free, intelligible action, right? Rather than merely for the possibility of randomness. Another question you might ask yourselves about this argument, the pessimist incompatibilist argument, is whether there's any way of salvaging free will and moral responsibility from the truth of causal determinism. So here, this might bring you back to the compatibilist argument or line of thought, and to think about how you would argue that the meaningful type of freedom that's required for moral responsibility might be salvaged. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I'll leave you with just a few thoughts on this final view that I listed. But again, as I said, this is not something you need to go into in your essays, but that you just might want to reflect on. So Strawson's view that I mentioned, this is the view that starts from the idea that assuming moral responsibility is actually our starting point. It's the fundamental background to how we interact and relate to one another. So in other words, we cannot but treat each other as morally responsible agents. It's presupposed by our even considering the question of whether we have free will. So we're discussing this question as if we had a choice in what view to take, as if we could be blamed for not thinking things through carefully, that we could be blamed for not taking the right approach, not drawing the correct consequences. Right, so it's not a perspective on Strawson's view that we can actually give up without losing all ability to meaningfully interact or to even engage in philosophical discussion about any topic, and not least about free will and determinism. Right, so he argues that this is the case even if we accept that determinism puts into question one of these fundamental assumptions about how we relate to each other, how we cannot but relate to each other. Right. Since we cannot do otherwise but relate to each other as morally responsible agents, the view is that, well, it doesn't make sense either to say that we ought not relate to each other in this way, even if we think that there's a problem in trying to square determinism with free will and moral responsibility. So we may accept that there's an intellectual problem there, but it's not one that we can take on in our day-to-day lives. And given that we cannot adopt that stance of rejecting the sense that we're morally responsible agents, then it really doesn't make sense to say that this is something we ought to do. So following this well-known maxim that ought implies can, you cannot say that you ought to do something if it's impossible to do that thing. So I'll leave you with these thoughts on free will. and move on next to our second topic of the seminar, personal identity, which, as we saw in the seminar, bears some interesting relations to this first topic, which we can explore now. So on personal identity, you read two papers, or in the first case, rather, an extract, in the case of John Locke, an extract from his essay concerning human understanding, and you read Bernard Williams's paper, The Self and the Future. Now, as with free will, we focused more on the key issues than on the details of these particular works, and that's also what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to try to sum up the broad problem that Locke and Williams are grappling with, and I'll try to set out the theoretical terrain of options available for addressing this problem, and then hopefully this will also give you an opportunity to develop your own view about which is the correct approach in response to the problem of personal identity through time. In our seminar discussion, a number of different questions that sound like questions about personal identity came up, and we tried to distinguish between some of these different questions about personhood that one might ask. There are in fact a number of questions that one might ask about personhood. So the best place to start really is to get clear about what the question about personal identity is specifically. And that's the question by what is the question of personal identity? I mean the one that Locke and Bernard Williams discuss and that others discuss in relation to those papers. So there are a number of questions one might ask about personhood. They're not all about the question that these particular authors are addressing. So one such question about personhood that one might ask is that of what is a person, in the sense of what is a person as distinct from a being that's not a person at all, right? So as distinct from a non-human animal, which we wouldn't think of as a person, or perhaps a human that's in a persistent vegetative state we may not think of as a person in the kind of sense that we've been discussing in the context of thinking about free will, for example. So this is a question about sort of what properties are such that if they were lacking, we would take to be a sign of lack of personhood. Here you might think about whether that property is being conscious, whether it's being a member of the human species, whether it's being rational, whether it's being capable of a certain kind of freedom of choice, perhaps a quite sophisticated ability to reason through options, and so forth. Another question one might ask about personhood is that of what kind of a thing a person is. So what type of entity is it? So, for example, is a person a kind of substance? If so, what kind of substance? Is it a mental substance, as Descartes, for instance, claims? Or is it a physical substance, so just some kind of a brain or the human body? Or is a person perhaps a collection of properties, so a bundle of perceptions, as suggested by David Hume, for example? Or is a person a living human being that has both mental and physical characteristics? So this is a question about what type of entity a person is. Another question is that of how we individuate persons. So what is the criterion for counting people? Is it one human being, one person? If so, well, what about split brain patients who end up with two spheres of consciousness, as has been done sometimes with epilepsy patients, where the two brain hemispheres are severed in order to stop the epilepsy episodes, but it creates two spheres of consciousness. So do we have here two persons and one brain? What about people with split personality disorder? So can there be more than one person per human body? Or can there be one person across more than one body? Okay, so that's this type of question about the individuation of persons. Yet another question is more about our sense of who we are. So it's about what we identify with, what aspects of ourselves we hold to be important to our sense of who we are. Okay, so in relation to this, you might ask things like what facts about your past, about your characteristics that you now possess, or about the activities that you engage in, such as your work or your studies or whatever, are essential to your sense of who you are as a particular individual, right? So what changes in your properties would result in a sense of your loss of a sense of who you are. So this is kind of more a psychological question than a metaphysical one, but it is a question about personhood. And there's the question of what follows from being a person. So this is essentially the question of what rights and responsibilities somebody should be thought to have by virtue of being a person. Right? Should they be considered morally responsible, for example, by virtue of being a person, and so forth? Should they have certain rights? Should they have certain responsibilities? And finally, there's the question of what constitutes personal identity over time or through time. Now, this is the fundamental question that Locke is addressing, that Williams is addressing, and that we talked about in the seminar, and that I'll be focusing on in the summary. So this is essentially the question of what makes a person at one time identical with a person at another time. So is it the persistence of some entity? Is it the holding of a relation? If so, is that relation the relation of psychological continuity between a person at one time and a person at another time? Or is it the existence of physical continuity between a person at one time and a person at another time? In any case, this question presupposes answers to many of the other questions. It takes for granted, in particular, that we've got hold of persons. So that's not in question. We have hold of a being at one time and a being at another time that both qualify as persons. They have the distinctive features, whatever they are, of personhood. They are individuals. So there's no question about what type of beings we're talking about. The question here is that of what makes one of these identical to another one of these, and in particular across time. Okay, so now that we have an idea of what the question is, you might wonder, okay, well, why does it matter? Why is this important? And it's important in two ways. One, in relation to thinking about yourself, your own past and your own future, and also in relation to thinking of others. So in our own case, we might, for instance, wonder what makes us now the same person as, say, a 10-year-old girl or boy that we seem to remember being. Or perhaps of even greater interest, you might wonder what will make a future person count as still being you. So how should you view the prospect, for example, of a future pleasurable experience, such as being on the holiday that you might now be planning? Right? What makes it the case that you will be on that holiday, that you will be having that pleasurable experience rather than, say, somebody else? Okay, some kind of somebody who remembers being you but isn't actually you. Or how should you view, for example, a less pleasant prospect, such as the possibility of memory loss in the future or the prospect of being in physical pain? Should you be worried? Will you be the one suffering? Okay, so if a future person, say with Alzheimer's, won't remember anything about your life, even though they're physically continuous with you, should you consider that you will no longer be there and that you'll have, in essence, escaped the fate of dementia? Someone else will be suffering, not you. So these are the kinds of questions that you might ask yourself in terms of how the question of personal identity relates to things that might matter to you. Will you be the person who goes on that holiday? Will you be there demented in the future? Will you be experiencing pain that there's a prospect of you or of somebody in the future experiencing? Equally important is the question with respect to our treatment of others. So should we blame people for actions that occurred in the far past? Right? Well, you might wonder what makes someone convicted of a crime today truly count as being the same person as the one who committed the crime, perhaps many years earlier. So in other words, the question of what constitutes personal identity over time is not just interesting from an intellectual point of view, as might be the parallel question about the identity of objects over time, and we discussed the similarities and differences between these questions in the seminar. But it's a question of pressing concern, so it matters to us whether we will still be there in the future, and also matters from a moral point of view whether the people we blame or praise today are those who did the blameworthy or praiseworthy actions yesterday. So here, just like with free will, questions of personal identity are fundamental to our thinking about this topic. So many of our practices, for example, punishment, many of our decisions, about, say, whether we should consent to certain neurological procedures. Many of our attitudes, our emotional attitudes, such as of apprehension or excitement about the future, rest firmly on our assumptions about personal identity, including our relations to others. Should we consider this person who's suffering from dementia, who doesn't remember our name, doesn't remember the experiences they had with us, should we consider them to still be the person that we had a close relationship with? Should we still care about them in a personal sense? Obviously in a general sense we might, but should we consider them to be the same person as a person we had a strong bond with previously? Right. So answering the question of what constitutes personal identity across time will have clear and important implications for how we view the future, how we view the past, and for how we ought to relate to each other. Right, so this is the question. Here are some of the reasons why it matters. So what is the problem? Okay, so why might answering this question of what constitutes personal identity through time be particularly problematic from a philosophical point of view? Here, in a nutshell, is the problem. Talk of identity between persons over time seems to imply that there is some entity which persists unchanged through time. It seems to imply this because of the law of identity. According to the law of identity, A is identical to B if A and B have all their properties in common. And if A and B do not have all their properties in common, then they cannot be one and the same thing. According to Leibniz's law of the identity of indiscernibles, if there is nothing to distinguish two things, then they are in fact one and the same, and vice versa. Two things are one and the same, they are numerically identical, if there is absolutely nothing that distinguishes them. The problem when thinking about the identity of persons through time is that persons at different stages of their lives do not have all of their properties in common. There appears to be no entity that persists entirely unaltered through our bodily and mental changes, unless, that is, we assume the existence of some highly problematic bare locum or soul conception of the person. So from what we can tell, persons do not seem to be the kinds of things that remain unchanged over time. Our cells are constantly being replaced, and our psychological states are in constant flux. So given that there may be no such thing as strict identity in Leibniz's sense between persons at different times, what else could we mean by A is the same person as B? Or by such statements as, I was a 10-year-old child and will one day be a 70-year-old woman? When we say this, we cannot mean that the 10-year-old child or the 70-year-old woman in the future have all of their properties in common with me now, let alone with each other. The 70-year-old woman and the 10-year-old child may have no properties in common. So what might we mean when we make such identity statements? Or even when we assume that we will continue to exist? Could we mean that certain important kinds of relations of continuity or of connectedness hold between certain persons at different times, and that that is what makes them the same person? If so, what kind of continuity is needed? Psychological continuity? Bodily continuity? Both perhaps? To what extent does the relevant kind of continuity need to hold between persons at different times in order for them to constitute one and the same person? And crucially, how do we even go about finding out? In order to figure out how to proceed, we need to first get clear about exactly what kind of question we're asking. Is it an empirical question? That is it a question about how things are in the world? Or is the question about what makes a person at one time identical to a person at another time instead a question about the meanings of our terms? That is, about what we mean when we say that someone is the same person as another. Or is the question we're asking one about our subjective experience? Well, for a start, it does not seem to be an empirical question. After all, no amount of investigation into the mental and physical characteristics of a person at one time and of a person at another time will tell us whether they are one and the same unless we have already determined what the criteria are for saying that they are one and the same. So the question seems to be first and foremost one about what we mean when we say that a person has continued to exist, or that a person is the same as a past person. It's importantly not just a question about what we mean by this, but also about what matters to us when we say such things. When we say that two people are the same, we're saying that the relation that holds between them is one that matters when we relate to these people, or in our own case, when we think about our future. Right, so what we need to work out is what criteria of personal identity we are implying when we say that a person at one time is the same as a person at another time, or when we assume that we will continue to exist in the future. What criteria do we take to be important when we consider whether someone in the future will be us as opposed to someone else? Or when we decide whether a person in the courtroom deserves punishment for a past crime, or deserves praise for a distant past act of bravery? Insofar as we're trying to engage in a process of uncovering what we mean by personal identity in a sense that matters to us, one way of going about answering our question about the identity of persons over time will be by testing our intuitions against particular puzzling cases. Cases where certain relations that would normally hold between persons over time are absent, and then seeing what we would say, or whether we would feel that what matters to us is preserved in these cases. In this way, we will be able to determine whether the holding of this or that type of relation is or is not essential to a person's continued existence in the sense that matters to us. For example, we might consider a thought experiment where we're faced with the prospect of a brain transplant, or with the prospect of the information from our brain being swapped with the information from another person's brain. How should we view our future in such a situation? Would we even consider ourselves to have a future following such a swap? If we would, where would we expect to end up? Which of the resulting two people would we care about the most, or would we care about at least in the way in which we care about ourselves? Which one would we think would be us? The one with the original body, but with the changed memories and thoughts? Or the one with our original thoughts and memories, but with a different body? Or consider a different scenario. Suppose you're given the opportunity to try out a new piece of technology, something you're told is a teletransporter. This will allow you, you're told, to travel to Mars to conduct some interesting scientific experiments. Let's assume you're a scientist and are quite keen to go to Mars. Suppose you're told that the teletransporter works like this. When you enter the teletransporter, your body and brain will be destroyed. Not to worry, however, before that happens, the psychological information from your brain, your memory, impressions, your personality, your beliefs, your decisions, and so on, will be copied and beamed to Mars. Then they'll be downloaded onto a physical duplicate of your body, even though made of different matter. How should you consider the prospect of entering the so-called teletransporter? Would you enter the teletransporter expecting to make it to Mars, or would you see entering this contraption as essentially walking to your own death, even if with the consolation that there will be a person on Mars who will think they are you and who will carry out your life's work? Now, how we would answer such questions can provide us with important clues about what we consider to be necessary or not, and what we consider to be sufficient or not for a future person to be us. By using thought experiments such as these, in other words, we'll be able to dig a bit deeper into what we actually mean when we say that a person at one time is or will be the same as a person at another time. Importantly, what such thought experiments can help reveal is what truly matters to us when we're concerned about our own survival, or when we relate to each other as individuals deserving of praise and blame and punishment and so on. So we'll be considering a number of such thought experiments as we assess various theories of personal identity. Many of these puzzling cases are not as far-fetched as it might initially seem. There are very similar cases which we're already faced with today, or which we may certainly be faced with in the near future. For example, we may be faced with the prospect of dementia and with the radical personality changes that go with dementia in our old age. We may be dealing with relatives in that situation and not be sure whether we would want to say that they are still the same person as the one we once cared about. In the near future, we may be confronted with medical advances which allow for damaged parts of our brain to be replaced. We would then be faced with the very real question of whether to accept such procedures as welcome cures or as merely hastening our demise. So confronting these kind of scenarios and other more far-fetched but analogous ones may be more than a purely academic exercise. We sometimes are, and may be even more so in the future, confronted with situations where answering questions about personal identity is urgent and highly relevant. So let's now consider some of the standard theoretical answers given to the question of what constitutes personal identity over time. And let's try to evaluate their plausibility by testing our intuitions against various puzzling cases. Here are some of the standard theoretical options available to answer our question. The one I'll be focusing on next is Locke's theory, which is a form of the so-called psychological continuity approach to personal identity. Other theories or common approaches include the bodily continuity view, which I'll touch on after Locke's. And some of the others, which I'm not going to cover here, include, for example, combined psychological and bodily continuity accounts, such as Johnston's, which you can read in a paper of his entitled Human Beings, if you're interested. There are also bare locum theories, according to which personal identity through time consists in the persistence of a kind of unchanging Cartesian soul. And finally, there are positions such as Parfit's, according to which we should essentially cease to care about identity, right? So strict personal identity over time is not what matters when thinking about the future or when relating to others, according to Parfit, or at least it should not be what matters. So this gives you a broad but not exhaustive map of the terrain of possible theoretical options on the topic of personal identity. And with this map in mind, let's hone in now on the first of these, and specifically on Locke's theory. According to Locke, we need to distinguish first between the idea of a man or a human being on the one hand, and the idea of a person on the other. This is not to imply that a person and a human being are separate substances in a kind of Cartesian sense, but merely to say that our concept of a person implies, for instance, having mental states and being conscious, while our concept of a human being does not. According to Locke, when we talk about persons, we have in mind beings with thoughts, beliefs, desires, memories, intentions, and so on. What kind of substance supports these mental states is not important. At least it's not important for these purposes. What matters is that the being in question has such mental states. This is what makes that being a person. Now, when it comes to the question of what makes a person at one time identical to a person at another time, Locke's answer is straightforward and in many ways highly intuitive. A person at a later time is the same person as a person at an earlier time if there is continuity of consciousness between them. Or put more simply in terms of memories, if the person at the later time remembers what the person at the earlier time did, thought, experienced, and so on. This is, as I mentioned earlier, a version of the so-called psychological continuity theory of personal identity, according to which it's both a necessary and a sufficient condition for persons at different times to count as one and the same, that they be psychologically continuous with each other. Now, Locke's version of this theory is a particularly strong version in that mere continuity of memory is not enough. What is needed is direct psychological connectedness. So what's the difference? Well, if an adult remembers what a child was thinking, and an older person remembers what the adult was thinking, but not what the child was thinking, the old person and the child can be said to be, in a sense, psychologically continuous with each other by virtue of the existence of an overlapping chain of direct memory connections linking the one to the other. But they cannot be said to be psychologically connected. Right? On Locke's theory, if the old person does not remember what the child did, they, the old person and the child, cannot strictly be said to be the same person. This, of course, poses a problem for the transitivity of identity, insofar as it's hard to see how the old person could be the same person as the adult, and the adult the same person as the child, but the child not the same person as the old person. Let's leave this issue aside, though, and focus on the important part of the claim, the claim that what is needed for personal identity through time is not continuity of the body, but only psychological continuity or connectedness. On the face of it, this seems plausible enough. There are a number of possible arguments which seem to support this view. First of all, we often speak in ways that line up with this view. We say things like, "He is not the person I married." Or we might say of a relative with dementia, that the person we knew is no longer there. Or, after a night out of too much drinking, we might excuse our uncharacteristically unsophisticated behavior by saying, somewhat paradoxically, that we were not ourselves. Not only do we say things that suggest that we see psychological continuity or connectedness as both necessary and sufficient for personal identity, but our attitudes, particularly our attitudes of praise and blame, seem to also align somewhat with the Lockean view. For example, we may hesitate to punish a person with dementia or with total amnesia for past acts that they no longer identify with. We may also be more lenient, and indeed our laws tend to be more lenient, on those who can be shown to have acted in a moment of out-of-character madness, as if it was not quite them who acted. The Lockean approach to personal identity also seems to have a certain subjective plausibility. If you think about it, subjectively, continuity of consciousness, particularly of memories, matters to us. We feel that we were a child when we remember being that child. When we look into the future, it also matters to us that we will remember what we did today, that we will remember what we decided, and that we will therefore carry through our projects. We may in fact view the prospect of losing our memory as being as bad as the prospect of an early death. Now, the Lockean view also seems to make sense, at first glance at least, when considered in the context of certain common thought experiments. So-called body swap or mind swap thought experiments seem to support the psychological continuity approach to personal identity. Right, so when contemplating a scenario where we're told, say, that our memories and other psychological states will be removed from our current brain and body and implanted in the brain and body of a current other person, and vice versa, it seems subjectively more plausible to interpret what is about to happen as an instance of body swap rather than as an instance of mind swap. Why? Well, because when projecting ourselves into the backward-looking perspective of the two resulting people, it is the person who ends up with our memories and personality features which will consider themselves to be us. Upon waking up, so to speak, after this body or mind swap experiment, each resulting person will be convinced that they have swapped bodies rather than that they have swapped minds. Right, so projecting ourselves forward into the backward-looking point of view of these two people makes the psychological continuity theory seem more plausible. It seems to make more sense of the situation from the point of view of its participants. And yet, if we think about Locke's memory theory of personal identity a bit further, problems seem to emerge. One question one might pose for Locke's theory is this: does appealing to memory really provide us with a way of understanding what personal identity is? Or does it not itself already presuppose that we have a grip on what identity is? When I say that I remember doing something, what I seem to be saying is that I remember myself doing something. If I was not the person doing the thing I remember, I could not be said to remember it. I may have an impression of having done something, but this impression would not constitute a genuine memory. It would be an instance of imagining. Memory presupposes that the person now remembering is the very same person as the one who did the thing remembered. In other words, memory presupposes identity through time, presupposes that the person now is the same as the past person whose action is being recalled. A second question we might ask is whether we really take ourselves to be talking literally when we say that our spouse, for instance, is not the person we married, or that our relative suffering from Alzheimer's is no longer the person we care about. After all, we still visit our demented relative and care for them in a way that we would not be inclined to do if we considered them to truly be a stranger. Not to mention those instances when we claim to not have been ourselves. Now, A third point you might consider is that although we are likely to be more lenient when it comes to sentencing someone with amnesia or someone who acted out of character or in a moment of madness or drunken stupor, we would still generally consider them to have been the person who committed whatever the act was. We would certainly not blame anyone else. We would not, for instance, consider it appropriate to punish someone who believes they committed the crime or who has a memory impression of having done so, but whose current body was nowhere near the scene at the time. Finally, think about the mind-body swap thought experiments, right? A bit like Locke's prince and cobbler example, where the person with the prince's body wakes up with the memories of the cobbler, and where the person with the cobbler body wakes up thinking that they're the prince, right? We may find that our intuitions do not quite line up with Locke's intuitions about such cases. This is something you might want to think about further. If you were told that you and a friend of yours would undergo a procedure whereby the memories and other psychological states of each of you would be wiped from your current brains and downloaded onto your friend's brain, how would you view this prospect? After this process, each of the resulting people would of course be convinced that they have moved into their friend's body. But they may be mistaken. How might we work out what's the right way to look at this kind of situation? The second most common approach to the question of what the numerical identity of persons through time consists in is the bodily continuity approach. Now, this is essentially the reverse of the psychological continuity view, in that according to this view, psychological continuity is not necessary for sameness of persons through time, whereas bodily continuity is necessary and indeed sufficient for people at different times to count as one and the same. This is indeed the view that Williams, although somewhat hesitantly, would put his money on, so to speak, and we'll see why in a minute. I won't go over the other options listed here of how to approach the problem of personal identity, but these are options you may want to read about yourselves if you're not entirely satisfied either with a pure psychological continuity approach or with a pure bodily continuity approach. In his paper, The Self in the Future, Williams runs essentially through two thought experiments, or as we'll see, he presents the same scenario in two different ways. The first is a way which makes the situation seem like an instance of body swap, much as Locke describes the example he gives of the prince and the cobbler. The second way of presenting this situation makes it more plausible to interpret it as a case where two people have undergone radical psychological changes but stayed very much in their original bodies. Williams himself feels the pull of both of these interpretations, the first one supporting a psychological continuity criterion of identity through time, and the other supporting a bodily continuity criterion. In the end, Williams is more inclined to side with the second interpretation. We'll see why in a little while. But first, let's run through each of these thought experiments or each of these presentations of a particular situation and see how, by being pulled in opposite directions by these experiments, we might be left more confused about what constitutes personal identity at the end of reading Williams's paper than we might have been at the beginning. Williams starts his paper by setting up a version of the following thought experiment. Suppose we have two people, A and B, who are, for whatever reason, willing, or perhaps they're forced, to take part in a unique procedure. The scientist in charge of the procedure prepares them for what is about to take place. Their memory impressions, their thoughts, beliefs, preferences, and all the other information from each of their brain will be copied and downloaded onto the other person's brain. When, a bit worried, they ask the scientist how this is supposed to work, the scientist explains it as follows. It's a bit like copying a digital application or a program from one computer and pasting it into an external hard drive. Then, after some minor repairs are done to the original computer, the application is copied from the external hard drive back into the original computer. In this case, we would say that the application has been restored, not that a new one has been put in its place. The two people are supposed to undergo a similar procedure, where instead of a computer application, it is the functional organization and information from their brains that will be copied. The main difference in their case, says the scientist, is that the information from their brain, their memories, their ways of thinking, and so on, will be copied and pasted not back into their original brain, but into a different brain, that of the other person. At this point, they'll be wondering where they will wake up. The scientist, though, adds a further piece of information which may help focus their minds. One of the resulting people, they're told, will be given a lot of money, and the other will not. So one resulting person will be pleased, and the other rather disappointed. In fact, they're told, the other person will be tortured. The scientist, however, gives the initial two people, A and B, a choice, or at least he allows them to express a preference. Which of the two resulting people should get the money, and which should be the one who ends up being tortured? Let's assume for present purposes that the two initial people, A and B, are mostly concerned about themselves, rather than about the other person, whom they hardly know, let's assume. What they want is to avoid being tortured, and would quite like to get the money. Would they rather that the resulting A body person be tortured and the B body person given the money, or vice versa, the B body person tortured and the A body person given the money? Suppose they're both inclined to view that what will happen is a case of body swap. A will therefore want the A body person to be tortured, while B will want the resulting B body person to be tortured. Right, so A and B undergo the procedure, after which the scientist tortures the A body person and gives the resulting B body person the money. When asked, the resulting A body person, with the memory impressions of the original B person, complains that they did not get what they asked for. The B body person, with the original person A's memories, feels relieved and convinced that they got what they asked for. This result, based on the perspective of the resulting people, supports the view that the resulting A body person is B, and that the resulting B body person is A. This is certainly how the two resulting people would see it, and how we might see it as outside observers speaking to them. But Williams then considers the possibility that A and B are not convinced by the idea that this procedure will result in an exchange of bodies. They think that they will still be the person with their current body, and are very concerned to avoid being tortured, and hopeful that their life will be made better by having the promised money. In line with this view, the A body person requests that the resulting B body person be tortured, and the current person B requests that the future A body person be tortured. The experiment proceeds, and as before, the scientist tortures the resulting A body person and gives the money to the B body person. When questioned after the experiment, the resulting B body person will say that they did not get what they asked for, but that they're happy they didn't. The resulting A body person, on the other hand, will claim that they got what they asked for, but wish they had made a different choice, or they wish the scientist had done the reverse. Once again, therefore, it seems that if we look at things from the third person perspective, speaking to the resulting people, it would seem natural to say that the B body person is now the original A, and that the resulting A body person is the original B. Williams suggests in his paper that it's a potentially significant feature of this experiment that it's described from the third person perspective. Note, however, that the same intuitions persist if we project ourselves into the perspectives of either of the resulting people. From the point of view of the two people themselves, whoever they in fact are after the experiment, it seems to them that they have just swapped bodies. What is perhaps significant, however, as we'll see later, is that the first person perspective we're considering in this thought experiment is that of the resulting people looking back at what has just happened, rather than the perspective of the initial people looking forward into the future. To the extent that the forward-looking original people also feel that they will swap bodies, their intuitions are likely to arise primarily from them projecting themselves into the position of the resulting people looking back. So again, the perspective that's really focused on in this experiment is that of the people at the end rather than at the beginning of the experiment. So let's try now to focus instead solely on the forward-looking perspective. That is, on the point of view of the initial participants, or indeed on the point of view of just one of the initial participants as they're being told what's about to happen, and trying not to draw their attention too much to how the person at the end of the experiment might or might not view what has occurred. Following the description of what appears to be a body swap experiment, Williams asks us to take a different starting point. In his second thought experiment, he asks us to imagine ourselves being in the following situation. You're under the power of someone who tells you that you will be tortured. The appeal to torture in this and other examples is of course not there simply gratuitously, but really to ensure that this is a situation in which we have a genuine self-interested reason to care about what's going to happen, and in particular, to care about the question of whether it will be us who is the person in that situation. Right, so upon being given this information, namely that you're going to be tortured, you'd understandably be afraid. The scientist, however, immediately adds a further piece of information. He tells you that, before the torture happens, your memory of having been told that you will be tortured will be wiped out. You may be interested to hear this, but it will certainly not make you any less afraid. On the contrary, the thought of the torture when it comes catching you by surprise is likely to strike you as an even more terrifying prospect. The scientist at this point lets you in on another detail of what will happen. You will be made to undergo a procedure which will make you forget everything about your past life, not just the fact that you were forewarned of the torture. Should you still be afraid? The most intuitive reaction to this new piece of information is likely to be, yet again, even greater fear, or at least not any less. The torture still seems to be clearly a fate that will befall you. The fact that it will be preceded by total amnesia is likely to provide precious little consolation. The person in charge then adds a further detail. Your memories, you're told, will not just be wiped out, but a whole set of other memory impressions will take their place. Your personality will also be altered. You will perhaps be convinced that you're a great artist and that your work is exhibited in some of the greatest galleries of the world. Should you still fear the torture? Would you still fear the torture that is about to be administered? Once again, intuitively, it seems that this new piece of information about what will precede the torture is not going to save you. The fact that you will lose your memory and acquire delusions of artistic grandeur are unlikely to make the torture any less painful. Your fear of what is about to happen is not likely to be dampened. If anything, in fact, your fear of the torture is likely to be compounded by the fear of going mad beforehand. The scientist next tells you that, as it happens, your new memories will match exactly the life experiences and actions of a current living person, an actual artist with great talent and a certain following. Will this new piece of information calm your nerves? Again, it seems unlikely. Who you think you are, whether someone entirely fictitious or a real living person, does not in any way seem to negate the torture you will suffer. The person in charge of your fate is still adamant that the torture will be carried out. They're just filling you in on what will happen before that. Eventually, in fact, disclosing to you the full picture of what process you will undergo prior to the torture and what processes someone else will undergo as it happens. The procedure you're going to undergo before the torture takes place will be accompanied, you're now told, by another person, in fact, the very person whom you're going to be convinced of being, undergoing a parallel procedure that will result in them acquiring all of the information that had previously been copied and then wiped from your brain. They will be convinced that they are you. They will feel as you did, share your interests, have memory impressions of your past life, and so on. What's more than that, they will not be tortured, but will be given £100,000. At this point, you might start to feel a bit irritated, wondering how any of this information is supposed to help you. What will or will not happen to a third party seems to have nothing to do with the fate that awaits you. Your reaction is likely to remain that of fear of the torture, combined with increasing concerns about the state of mind you will be in when that happens. Yet, it will surely not have passed you by that the situation you're contemplating is, for all intents and purposes now, the same as the one painted in Williams's first thought experiment. There are two people at the start of this thought experiment. The information from their brains will be swapped, and at the end, one person will be tortured and the other one will be given a large sum of money. So, which of the two presentations of this scenario should we consider to be less misleading? The first one which generates the intuition that psychological continuity is the key criterion for personal identity, or the second one, which pulls us in the direction of a bodily continuity view. According to Bernard Williams, the first presentation of the swap scenario is somewhat more misleading than the second for two reasons. First of all, the first presentation is set out, he claims, from the third-person perspective rather than from the first-person perspective. The suggestion that the initial people A and B have swapped bodies is most plausible when looked at, as it would seem, from the perspective of an outsider talking to the resulting individuals. From this third-person point of view, the point of view of someone who, for instance, knows A and B very well, it would seem eerily as if A was now in B's body and B in A's body. Yet the perspective from which personal identity matters to us the most is the first-person perspective. When thinking about our own survival, what really matters is how things will or will not be, or how they will or will not feel to us, rather than to someone else looking at the situation from the outside, who's not actually experiencing what the participants in the experiment are experiencing. The second point that, according to Williams, renders the first presentation of the thought experiment misleading is that it skips straight to describing a single final outcome, without noting the various ways in which this outcome is similar to other outcomes, which we would think of as very clearly ones where bodily continuity is the determining factor in deciding where a person has ended up. By not mentioning these alternatives, the first presentation of the thought experiment encourages us to imagine only a very neat situation where there are two people at the start of the experiment with properly functioning mental capacities, and two at the end who also appear to be perfectly normal. The only difference being that the memory impressions and mental capacities of each resulting person fits better with those that used to be possessed by the person with the other body. Williams is no doubt right that the first presentation makes the situation seem too simple and clear-cut. But let's look at the claim that a significant difference between the two presentations is that one gets us to look at it from the third-person point of view and the other from the first-person point of view. As I mentioned in passing earlier, it's not actually clear that the intuitions generated by the first presentation of the thought experiment really do emerge from it being set out from a third-person perspective. In fact, the same intuitions arise from projecting ourselves into the first-person perspectives of the resulting people. From their point of view, what has occurred is a body swap. From the point of view of the B body person at the end of the experiment, they are A, and from the point of view of the A body person, they are clearly B. So the sense that psychological continuity is key to personal identity is not something that arises purely from a third-person outlook on this situation. The psychological continuity view seems to capture the first-person perspective of the resulting people particularly well, and indeed how things would seem to the people at the start of the experiment if they were to project themselves into the backward-looking perspective of the people at the end of the experiment. This, that is, the focus on the perspective of the people at the end, is perhaps what makes the first presentation so misleading, rather than any first-person, third-person difference in presentation between the first and the second thought experiment. Consider the asymmetry between the perspective of someone looking forward to the future and the perspective of someone looking backwards at something that has already happened. From this latter perspective, the backwards-looking perspective, there is no real problem about survival or about continued existence. Whoever the person looking back is, their survival is not in doubt, regardless of whether they are or are not a past person to whom various things were done and with whom they're psychologically continuous. The concern about survival, one might argue, only truly arises from the forward-looking perspective, for the person who is here now looking into the future. It is the person looking forward who faces in these type of thought experiments the possibility of death, the possibility of torture, loss of memory, or the possibility of getting money or other pleasurable experiences. The person looking backwards does not face any of these things. Such things may well have occurred, but either they did not occur to this person, death certainly didn't occur to them since they're alive now, or if these things did happen to this person,
they can take comfort in the fact that whatever it is, the torture, memory loss is now all over with. Most importantly, from the backward-looking perspective of the psychological continuant of an initial person, there is no pressing problem about continued existence, that is, about identity through time, identity into the future. It is easy for this person to think of themselves as the person whose psychological states they identify with and whose life they seem to remember. If this past person was not strictly numerically the same as them, this makes little difference to their life now. The relevant perspective, therefore, one might argue, in relation to questions about survival, is the forward-looking perspective. Testing our intuitions about what matters when thinking about personal identity is therefore perhaps best thought through by looking at experiments that focus on this forward-looking perspective, rather than on experiments such as the body swap experiment or the prince and the cobbler experiment, which seem to focus our attention on the perspective of the people at the end of the experiment, the backward-looking people. The most pressing questions about our identity arise looking forward. And from this perspective, if Williams's second thought experiment is anything to go by, it would seem that what matters when thinking about personal identity is bodily continuity, not psychological continuity. You may, of course, disagree. If you do disagree, you're not alone in doing so. Most prominently, perhaps, the philosopher Derek Parfit, someone who's specifically concerned with the question of what matters when thinking from a forward-looking perspective about our own survival, argues that what matters from this perspective is not bodily continuity. On his view, all that matters, or all that ought to matter when looking into the future, is psychological continuity. What matters, or what ought to matter, is only that there be someone in the future who will carry out our projects, continue our lines of thought, and fulfill our aims. Whether this person should or can be thought of as strictly speaking numerically identical to us is, on Parfit's view, actually irrelevant. Now, this is a classic view in this area of inquiry, which will be very much worth reading if you want to pursue this topic further.
So here were some of the theories that you might want to think about when responding to your essay questions. Right, so I'll leave you with these essay questions here. So you can submit up to 2 formative essays, 1 on each of the 2 topics we covered. So don't do 2 on the same subject. I won't mark them if they're on the same subject. You don't have to do 2. You can submit just 1 essay. If you do 2, make sure that they're of no more than 1,750 words each. So you have a total of 3,500 words to play with across the 2 essays. If you're only submitting 1, I would suggest to stick to half of that word count, but if you're only submitting 1, you can go a little bit over the 1,750 words. But in any case, here are the questions. You have a choice between 2 questions on each topic. On free will, you can either answer the question, are free will and determinism compatible? Or you can answer the question, is a person morally responsible for an action only if they could have done otherwise? On identity, again, you have a choice between 2 questions. So answer just one of these. You can answer the first question, which is, what makes a 40-year-old in 2021 the same person as a 20-year-old in 2001? Or you can answer the question, is personal identity over time any more of a problem than the identity of rooms over time? So with these questions in mind, I look forward to reading your answers to them.